I'm going to talk to you about the black dog and why we don't care about it. Unfortunately, my talk isn't going to be about this cuddly, sweet animal. I'm sorry, I can see some disappointed faces. Instead, I'm going to be talking about a health condition that's old as mankind, a health condition which, across the ages and by different peoples, has been called a number of different things. And one such thing is the black dog. This is a term that was first coined by Samuel Johnson, an English writer, more than a few hundred years ago. But it's a term that became more widely known when it was used by this man, Britain's wartime Prime Minister. Winston Churchill wrote in his diaries about periods in his life when he was mysteriously crippled by the black dog. These periods arose apparently without any obvious reason. And during this period, Churchill would describe feeling extremely miserable, losing his concentration, not being able to sleep well, feeling fatigued all the time, to the extent that he could not even attend Parliament. And just as mysteriously as he would have the black dog, one fine day the black dog would disappear and he would recover and be back at work. Now, most mental health professionals, when they would read Churchill's diaries, would come to the conclusion that what he was suffering from was a depressive episode. Now, we wouldn't ever really know whether Churchill indeed had depression, because there's no real record of him ever having sought medical treatment for this condition, or having ever received a diagnosis for his black dog. So that's all we know. He had the black dog. But if he did have depression, it wouldn't be surprising. Because depression is one of the most common health conditions to affect humanity. Just how common? Well, the Global Burden of Disease Group has identified more than 500 studies from more than 100 countries that have examined the question of how common is depression in a population. And they've estimated that out of every 20 adults, at least one will be depressed. At least one will have the black dog. Now, that translates to about 300 million adults, as I speak, who currently live with a depressive episode. And here I'm not talking about the miseries of everyday life. I'm talking about a clinical condition. Now, the good news is that we also have solutions for this problem. And those solutions are summarized in this forthcoming World Bank volume. I've been involved with the Disease Control Priorities Project, examining the sorts of solutions for a range of mental and neurological conditions that are ready for scaling up. And the good news is that we have a number of solutions for the black dog: psychological treatments, drug interventions, social interventions. But here's the bad news. The majority of people who could benefit from these interventions do not, in fact, receive them. How big, in fact, is this so-called treatment gap? Well, even in the richest countries of the world, such as here in Britain, about 50% of all people with depression do not receive the interventions that can transform their lives. Not surprisingly, people in low and middle-income countries, developing countries, are less likely to receive those interventions. But exactly how big is the treatment gap in those countries is unimaginable. It turns out that approximately 90% of everyone with a depression in developing countries simply do not receive the kind of interventions that we know can change their lives. Now, I've spent the last 2 decades trying to figure out why is it that the global community, and particularly the health community, simply don't care about people with depression. Why are we not moved by their suffering in order to make these interventions available? One of the reasons that I've had to grapple with is this one. Because people simply don't believe that this is a health condition. I've often heard people say, well, isn't this just simply the misery of everyday life? Aren't you just medicalizing social suffering? And another kind of related idea is the idea that, well, actually, depression is a problem of the worried well, of the rich, of the affluent, who have nothing else to worry about. Poor people And people in poor countries have far more serious issues to be concerned about. Issues to do with basic needs like food and shelter and their physical health. Depression is a luxury item in the lives of these people. So over the past 2 decades, many members of my research community have been trying to generate evidence to demonstrate that depression isn't just a figment of one's imagination. One such evidence is to really examine the impact that depression has on the global burden of disease. The Global Burden of Disease group has been estimating the overall contribution of a range of health conditions to the overall pie of the burden of disease since 1990. When it published its first report in 1990, people were surprised to see that depression, even back then, was already one of the leading causes of the burden of disease in both men and women. In its most recent report, it turns out that the overall proportion has grown by more than 50% in the last 25 years and is projected to continue to grow. In fact, depression today is the leading cause of the burden of disease in women. The other myth, of course, is that, well, so be it. The fact is that depression is still a problem of the rich and of rich countries. Nothing could be further than the truth. Indeed, we now know that people who live in conditions of social disadvantage, the poor, for example, are far more likely to develop depression through a variety of different mechanisms. And we also know that when you're depressed, you're more likely to slide into depression due to a variety of reasons. For example, due to difficulties in being able to work. And so you get this vicious cycle, as it were, of poverty and depression. Moreover, depression isn't only a private suffering, it affects other people around you. And perhaps one of the most important other people around someone who's depressed is the newborn baby of a mother who's depressed. There's been a large body of work, in fact, trying to examine what the impact of depression in mothers is on their newborn babies, and enough evidence to actually pull together a systematic review that examined what is the effect of maternal depression on the growth of a newborn baby. And of course, we all know how important child nutrition and growth is in global health. What did these researchers find? Well, they reported that if your mother was depressed, you were 50% more likely to be underweight and 40% more likely to be stunted. Depression isn't only a figment of a mother's imagination. It has a profound and direct effect on a newborn baby's physical health. Now, it has to be said, despite all this evidence, many global health community members will argue to me and say, but listen, depression doesn't kill, and global health priorities are still being determined by the diseases that kill. And to that particular argument, I have a more difficult problem in trying to address evidence. And the reason for that is that the Global Burden of Disease group has tried to estimate the number of deaths attributable to depression, and what you see on this chart is their answer. In fact, their estimate is 0. It turns out that no deaths can be attributed to depression. However, as part of the Disease Control Priorities Project, what we did was we asked the same group of authors to re-look at this evidence and ask them the question that, could you estimate the number of deaths that could be due to depression, for example, in people who commit suicide? Or how many deaths in people who die of heart disease may have been averted if their depression had been treated? And they came up with a startling new estimate. It turns out that more than 2 million deaths a year could have been attributed to depression and therefore potentially prevented had the depression been treated. Now, of course, the American author John Steinbeck already knew this way before we epidemiologists got into the business, but sadly it turns out neither does global health evidence or literature make any difference. Because the next argument that the global health community makes is that, well, this evidence is all very well, but the problem still remains that we do not have enough mental health professionals to deliver the interventions you're asking us to deliver. And even if we had those mental health professionals, they're too darn expensive, so we can't afford them. Now, this is a particular challenge that the global mental health communities try to address over the last decade. And what has been the clever idea that they've come up with? Well, The idea is, if you can't find mental health specialists or you can't afford them, use ordinary people. Ordinary people in the community to deliver evidence-based interventions for depression. Over the last decade, landmark trials from Uganda, from Pakistan, and India have demonstrated how such approaches don't only lead to effective outcomes, but are also cheaper than doing nothing at all. Over the last decade, there's in fact been a substantial growth in the evidence base on these sorts of approaches, star-sharing approaches in which community-based workers, frontline workers, deliver psychological interventions, sufficient evidence, again, for systematic reviews to look at the overall impact of these interventions on people who are depressed. And one such example is this particular study that looked at the impact of psychosocial interventions being delivered by frontline workers for mothers who were depressed. And what they observed was that there was a 40% risk reduction in the prevalence of depression in those mothers who received this intervention. Now, you think, surely, this is the key to unlocking the vault. This kind of evidence must surely lead to huge amounts of resources being pumped up into scaling up these interventions. Well, this is a question that we could actually address empirically. We asked ourselves the question, how much impact has this kind of evidence had on development assistance for mental health? Now, development assistance is what rich countries give to developing countries to strengthen the health sector. And so we asked the question, over a 6-year period, from 2007 onwards, what's been the overall investment that rich countries have made through their development agencies towards the mental health system strengthening in developing countries? And we asked for 2 different metrics, the absolute amount, but more importantly, the proportion of the development assistance for health that is devoted to mental health. And this is what we found. It looks like there's been a nice increase from 2007 onwards, but the more important figure is shown in the red line. At no point in time over these 6 years did the proportion of development assistance for health, for mental health, exceed the 1% mark. And mind you, this is for all mental health conditions, not just depression. So it seems that science has gone as far as it can. And yet, the global health community simply does not seem to care. And that kind of leaves me wondering, why don't we care about suffering of this kind? Why don't we care about suffering that we know is common, disabling, kills, harms others, and for which we have interventions that are transformative and can be delivered by ordinary people? Why don't we care? And I guess we don't care because we're ashamed of mental illness. Because there's a stigma attached to this condition that we're scared of, that we dislike, that we abhor. Surely this is the same stigma that explains why, even today, some of the worst forms of the abuse of human rights continue to be perpetrated against people with mental illness around the world. Abuses that occur in hospitals, in prisons, in the community, at home, on the streets. Now, imagine, just for a moment, that these images were of people living with HIV/AIDS. Just for a moment, imagine that. And you can almost hear the outrage, the moral outrage, everywhere. You can almost hear the demands for a call to action, that this sort of abhorrent human rights abuse had to stop. But of course, these are all images, very recent ones, of people living with a mental illness. And all you can hear is a resounding silence. I think the HIV/AIDS story is one that does inspire me, because let's not forget that there are some considerable similarities with mental illness. I think we can all remember a time when HIV/AIDS was a deadly disease and people who were living with the virus were living in shame and fear, were discriminated against. And yet today, what a transformation we've seen. HIV/AIDS is now a chronic disease. People with this condition have the right to access care for free, even in the poorest countries of the world, and rich countries are supporting that action. There's a raft of legislations that protect people living with HIV and high-risk groups from stigma and discrimination. How did the HIV/AIDS community achieve this transformation? Well, it seems to me they achieved it by mobilizing civil society. Science was necessary, but it wasn't enough. The HIV community mobilized a range of different members of society, and most important of all, it empowered people living with HIV to take the cause leading from the front. Leading from the front to lead to the sorts of campaigns like the Treatment Action Campaign launched in Johannesburg way back in 1998, which of course has transformed the face of HIV/AIDS today. It seems to me that those of us who are concerned about why we don't care about the black dog and indeed other mental illnesses need to learn from the HIV/AIDS movement. We need to take a leaf out of that book. We need to ensure that people with mental illness and depression in particular are able to speak about their experiences and lead from the front. Men such as this particular gentleman. I started my talk with one European Prime Minister who struggled with his black dog, and I want to end with another European Prime Minister of a different era. We will never know whether Churchill actually had depression, but Kjell Bondevik, the Prime Minister of Norway, certainly took a very different course of action with his depression. He stunned the world community when in August 1998, he came on television and told his people that he was clinically depressed and that he needed to take sick leave in order to recover from his depression, like you would. So he gave over the reins of power to his deputy, disappeared so that he could get necessary treatment and support from his friends and family and his doctors, and in just under a month, recovered from his depression and came back to work. Amazingly, Mr. Bondevik was re-elected for a second term as Prime Minister of Norway a couple of years later. Now, I was very privileged to hear him speak a few years ago at the World Health Organization, and amongst many things that he said this. And as you read this, you will realize how important the power of personal narratives is in unlocking stigma. Indeed, the personal story is the most important. Yeah, I believe that it is only when people like Mr. Bondevik are able to disclose their depression without any fear or shame. I believe that it is only when people like Mr. Bondevik are able to access the interventions for their depression that we know can transform their lives. I believe that it is only when people like Mr. Bondevik on recovery can go back to their original jobs without discrimination and indeed get re-elected in his case. I believe that's only then can we truly say about the black dog that we care. Thank you.